Among the phenomena that we've been studying at the Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS, for the past 40 years have been near-death experiences, or NDEs. Many people, when they come close to death, report unusual and profound experiences in which they appear to have left their bodies and claim to have moved beyond the boundaries of time and space. These NDEs have been recorded in a variety of ancient cultures. You can find them in the writings of Plato, in the Bible, in writings from Tibet, India, Egypt, China, Japan, and in the folklore of the South Pacific and Native Americans. The interpretation of these experiences varies from culture to culture, but the basic phenomena remain the same across the globe and across the centuries. These experiences near death were recorded in medical literature in journals in the 19th century, and they were described as a discrete syndrome in 1892 by Heim. They were written about quite a bit in French academic journals in the 1890s, when Victor Egger gave them the term near-death experiences. That term became popular in English in 1975 when a book was written by a UVA intern named Raymond Moody called Life After Life. There remains some controversy now about what causes NDEs and what their ultimate meaning is, but there's no question about their incidence or their impact on people. A variety of studies here at UVA and in Europe and the UK suggest that they occur to about 20% of people who have a documented cardiac arrest in study after study. We at UVA have developed a model of the NDE and a scale to quantify the depth of NDEs that's been used in hundreds of studies around the world. It basically looks at NDEs as being composed of 4 component parts: changes in thought processes, changes in emotional states, apparently paranormal phenomena, and what seem to be otherworldly phenomena. The changes in thought processes include a sense of time being distorted. People often talk about having a sense of timelessness, thinking being faster and clearer than usual, having a life review or panoramic memory where your entire life flashes before your eyes, and a sense of sudden understanding or revelation where everything becomes crystal clear. The changes in feeling include a sense of peace and well-being, feelings of joy, a sense of oneness or cosmic unity, and an encounter with what seems to be a loving, warm being of light. The apparently paranormal features include extraordinary sensory vividness. People report seeing colors they have never seen on Earth, hearing sounds they've never heard before, having what seems to be frank extrasensory perception of things going on elsewhere, visions of the future, and a sense of leaving the physical body. The otherworldly features include being in an otherworldly realm, unearthly or mystical realm, encountering some mystical being or presence, seeing deceased spirits or religious spirits, and coming to a border or point of no return beyond which you can't come back. Now, most NDEs, in fact, have a combination of all 4 of these elements to varying degrees. As an example, let me give you the report of one woman who had the following experience. She said, "During the war, I was very ill in the hospital. One morning, the nurse came in and found me showing no sign of life whatever. She called the doctors, to whom I also appeared dead, and I remained so, they told me afterwards, for at least 20 minutes. I became aware of a brilliant light and felt drawn toward it. It seemed that time was different or non-existent there, wherever there was. The light was beautiful to look at and projected feelings of unconditional love and peace. Looking around, I found myself in a beautiful green undulating country. I then saw a young officer with a few soldiers approaching. The officer was my favorite cousin, Albin. I did not know that he had died, nor had I ever seen him in uniform. But what I saw of him was confirmed by a photograph I had seen many years later. We spoke for a few minutes, happily, and then he and the few men with him marched off. Then a presence beside me explained that these soldiers were allowed to go and greet others who were dying and help them meet their death. My next vivid recollection after this was of looking down from about ceiling height onto a bed on which lay a very emaciated body. There were white-coated doctors and nurses around it. I yelled out to them, but they couldn't hear me. I could see everything clearly and felt warm, safe, and peaceful. In a few moments, I was looking up at them and feeling a sensation of intense disappointment. I had come back from something so lovely and so utterly satisfying. 2 days later, the doctor told me that I was lucky I didn't die. I told him that I did. He looked at me in a strange way and scheduled me for psychological evaluation. I learned to keep my mouth shut about that from that time on. Now, one of the problems we have in researching near-death experiences is that for the most part, they're retrospective. We're getting accounts from people who had the experience at some time in the past. That leaves open the question of how reliable memories of NDEs really are. Some authors have speculated that memories are embellished over the years, and particularly that the sense of well-being and peace and the pleasantness of the experience gets embellished over time. Because we've been studying these experiences for 4 decades now, we're able to address this question. Starting in 2002, I started trying to reconnect with people I had interviewed in the 1980s about their near-death experiences and asked them to describe their NDEs for me again. What we found, oops, I'm going the wrong way here, is that the NDE scale scores measuring the depth of the NDE were the same now in the 2000s as they were in the 1980s. And that held true for all 4 of the components: changes in thinking, changes in feeling, paranormal, and transcendental. So memories of the NDE are indeed reliable over years, and that suggests that retrospective research is also reliable. Another important question about retrospective reports of NDEs is whether they're influenced by cultural beliefs. We know that people's cultural beliefs influence how they interpret their perceptions. We see what we expect. For example, near-death experiences in third world countries do not talk about entering a tunnel the way Americans do. They may talk about entering a cave or a well. One truck driver who I interviewed talked about entering a tailpipe. So you tend to use whatever cultural metaphors are at your disposal to describe the phenomenon. So our NDE is just reporting what they expect to happen when they come close to death. The image of NDEs that most people have nowadays is the one described by Raymond Moody in 1975. Now, we've been collecting NDEs here at UVA since the 1960s, years before Moody's book came out. So we compared 24 experiences we collected in the 1960s with 24 recent experiences that were matched with the original ones in terms of age, race, gender, religion, cause of death, and proximity to death. What we found is that the features that Moody reported were reported just as often before the experience and after the experience, no matter what we looked at. The out-of-body experience, the feeling of peace, meeting others, a being of light, noises, or life review, all reported before Moody had described them as often as they are now. And that also held true for the after effects that Moody reported. Attitude changes, loss of fear of death, difficulty telling others, belief in survival after life, and corroboration of extrasensory perceptions, all reported as often before Moody described them as after. So reports do not seem to be influenced by the widespread public knowledge of NDEs, although the interpretation of the phenomena may be influenced by culture. The actual experience appears not to be. But even though these memories of NDEs are reliable and consistent over decades, that doesn't establish that their memories are real events, rather than memories of fantasies or hallucinations. To test that possibility, we used the Memory Characteristics Questionnaire, which was designed to differentiate memories of real events from memories of imagined events. This Memory Characteristics Questionnaire taps into 5 aspects of memories that reliably differentiate memories of real from imagined events. It includes the clarity of the memories, including the visual detail, sensory aspects like sound, smell, taste in the memory, contextual features like the memory for location and spatial arrangements, thoughts and feelings during the recalled event, and the intensity of feelings both during the event and now remembering it. we asked people who had come close to death to rate their memories of that event, and also of real events that happened around the same time in their lives, and also about an imagined event from that time in their lives. What we found is that for those people who had NDEs, the near-death experience was remembered with more clarity, more detail, more context, and more intense feelings than real events from the same time period. NDEs were recalled as realer than real events to the same degree that real events were remembered as realer than the imaginary events. On the other hand, people who did not have NDEs reported their close brush with death to be as real as other real events, but not realer. So NDEs are remembered with great consistency over decades, and are recalled as realer than real. How do we explain them? There are no variables that we found yet that can predict whether someone's going to have an NDE, neither age, race, gender, religion, religiosity, or mental illness. There's been lots of speculation about physiological variables that may be involved in NDEs, but the bottom line is that it's hard to reconcile enhanced mental function, thinking and perception being clearer and sharper than ever before, with impaired brain function, as you have in deep anesthesia or cardiac arrest. So why are near-death experiences of interest to health professionals? One reason is that there's a consistent pattern of after effects from near-death experiences, changes in beliefs, attitudes, and values. And these have been corroborated with long-term studies and interviews with significant others. We see increases in spirituality, a sense of concern or compassion for others, appreciation of life, a sense of meaning or purpose, confidence and flexibility in your coping skills, and a belief in post-mortem survival. And along with these, we see decreases in fear of death, a decreased interest in material possessions, decreased interest in status, power, prestige, and fame, and decreased interest in competition. A second reason that NDEs are important to us is for what they suggest about survival of bodily death. As Dr. Tucker mentioned, our division was founded to explore the possibility that something may survive after death, and NDEs do provide some evidence on that question. For example, we have enhanced cognition when the brain is impaired, such as by anesthesia or cardiac arrest, which suggests that the mind is not just what the brain does. Second, we have accurate perceptions from an out-of-body perspective. A recent review of over 100 published cases of people who had left their bodies during an NDE and reported seeing things showed that greater than 90% were 100% accurate. Further evidence of the potential independence of mind and brain. Third, we have accurate information that's imparted by deceased visitors in the NDE, such as the location of an important document or hidden treasure, which is evidence that these are encounters with interactive beings, not just mental images of the deceased. A striking example of this are NDEs in which the person meets in the experience someone who was not known at the time to be dead. An example was the experiencer I mentioned before, who saw her cousin Albin, who she had not known had died. Of course, she did know that he was a soldier, so it's conceivable she could have imagined that he had died, but that's not always the case. We also have the NDE from a young girl, an only child, who almost died during heart surgery, and said that in her near-death experience during surgery, she met someone who identified himself as her brother. When she told her father about this, he was so moved that he confessed to her that he had had a son she didn't know about who had died before she was born. We have identified dozens of cases of this type, some going back to ancient Greece. The bottom line is that our culture tends to talk about death as if it's the end of all existence. But NDE suggests that it may be more like a change of state.
Obviously, it's going to have to be very telegraphic, but we've put out brochures both down here and on the table outside where you can find us, find your way to our website, which contains lots more information, and the real justification for some outrageous things that I'm now going to tell you. My career kind of brackets what goes on at DOPS. I'm a little different in background. I started out as an experimental psychologist, studying psychology of language and cognitive science at Harvard in the 1960s. This is when we were recovering from the dark ages of behaviorism, beginning to realize that there are things like minds and consciousness and so on. I mean, I had absorbed the view that most scientists held then and most do now, which is that basically mind and consciousness are generated by physiological processes going on in brains. Well, late in the piece, when I was working on my dissertation, I became interested in experimental parapsychology. This had to do with some experiences involving my sister. And I learned to my amazement that there was a vast section of Widener Library devoted to the subject of psychical research, including a lot of experimental research that I'd never heard of before. And so I began reading it and eventually decided, well, this stuff looks really interesting, and if it really happens, something's fundamentally wrong with our basic scientific outlook. And so I decided to sign up with J.B. Ryan down at in Durham. You know, he had been at Duke most of his career, but had moved off campus. And so I started there at the usual $400 a month, 6-month trial period. And there were lots of idealistic young people who clamored to occupy those few slots. Within a month, I met a guy who erased any doubts I still had about the existence of the basic phenomena that Ryan was studying. This guy could do basically anything we asked him to do. He succeeded at controlled psi tasks at prodigious levels of statistical significance. So the first take-home lesson is, whether we like it or not, psi phenomena exist as facts of nature, and science is going to have to come to grips with that fact somehow. I had also gotten interested because of some things we found out about this guy in the possibility of measuring brain waves in relation to his performance in these tasks. And I won't go into that in any detail, but I'm happy to say that even though it kind of petered out at that time, this was in the School of Engineering, Electrical Engineering Department at Duke, where I encountered my colleague Ross Dunseith over here. Raise your hand. We spotted him. He was an undergraduate at the time. He's been with us ever since. Anyway, that group was there. We made some headway, but the technology really was not up to it. We laid the kind of conceptual, technical foundations, but couldn't do many of the things we hoped to do. We now have established at DOPS a really first-class neuroimaging facility and can begin to do things now that we could only dream about back in the 1970s. Okay, but now we come to the other part closer to this. I had to give up psycho research for a good long time, worked in neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill, all the UVA enemies, right, the core. Yeah, and we did some good things there and continued to develop our EEG techniques and so on. But I was anxious to find a way back into the field, and actually married one of Ian's longtime research collaborators, Emily Williams, in 1998, and retired early and moved here in 2002 so that we could work intensely on the first book, Irreducible Mind. Now, the way that came about was that Mike Murphy, who you may know as the co-founder of Esalen Institute out in Big Sur, California, which is now an island, apparently, by the way, due to the recent storms. He's an amazing man, much like Ian. In fact, we dedicated our book to Ian and Mike jointly, even though they never met in the flesh. They're both kind of descendants of the original founders of psychical research, that is, in the breadth of their scientific vision. Mike was well aware of the prevailing view in neuroscience, and that if that view is correct, there can be no survival, period. And that's an inescapable fact. If mainstream view of production of mind and consciousness by physiological processes in the brain is correct, there can be no survival. That's the fundamental biological objection to survival. And it's been elaborated ad nauseum in a recent book called The Myth of an Afterlife. Anyway, we started by just reviewing evidence for survival, which Mike was very interested in. But we gradually realized that we needed to undertake a much bigger project in 2 stages. Irreducible mind is the first stage, where we assembled in one place a whole lot of empirical evidence that we think disproves the conventional view of mind-brain relations. We incorporated all of the experimental parapsychology and survival research by reference. Didn't want to make it a book about science survival, but we wanted to use that evidence, so there's a big annotated bibliography in there. But we then went on to describe a variety of other well-documented empirical phenomena that are difficult or impossible to explain from a conventional point of view. And I won't go through it. They include things like extreme physiological influence, the manufacturing of things like stigmata or hypnotic blisters, even blisters having a specific geometrical form. They include in particular cases of the sort that Bruce talked about, near-death experiences under conditions such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest. And those are crucial because these things are happening under conditions that 99% of contemporary neuroscientists believe are, the conditions which neuroscientists believe are necessary for conscious experience have been abolished. And that can be shown categorically. The way we know that they had the experiences during the time of unconsciousness is that they can sometimes report things correctly, things that happened during that period. And there are subtle arguments about all that, but that's the basic idea. Anyway, the net result of this whole exercise, and I have to finish within the next minute or two, was to show that the correlations that exist between mental events and physical events, which we all accept, that's just how it is, can be interpreted in a different way. That is, that mind, consciousness, or something inherently larger than we normally know, that overflow the organism in some sense, but operate conditioned by the behavior of the brain and the sense organs and all the rest of it. Now, to me, that totally changed the landscape of the conceptual territory of the survival discussion, because now we have a way of thinking about the mind-brain connection that allows for the possibility that mind can operate separately from the organism. To me, that eroded the biological obstacle to survival. Okay, well, now we've got that far in a sort of psychological way. What does it all mean in terms of our fundamental worldview? That was the second, much harder job. And we struggled with it for a long time, but finally put together a book that's remarkable, at least for its authorship, because we have physicists, scholars of religion, and philosophers all under the covers of one book. And to cut to the bottom line, the basic picture is one that seems to invert the currently popular view of relation between the physical and the mental. We have begun to think we're being driven towards some kind of an idealistic picture in which mind is not derivative from matter, but if anything, the other way around. So it has fundamental implications for our basic vision of reality and our place in it. So I think I'll just stop there and we start questions.